your thoughts can be acidic. Your emotions can be acidic. To hold stored trauma is an acidification of your internal world, if you will.
Well, Ronnie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Craig. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I first heard you on Josh Trent's show, and a lot of your messages, a lot of what you shared deeply resonated. And it seemed like there may even have been some similarities in terms of our journey and some of the work that we've gotten into in our own coaching work and our own professional work. So I'd love to hear just, brief story, little background, like what got you into the world of holistic health, and especially kind of into the world of especially specializing in addiction as kind of one of your main areas of focus.
Yeah, well, I'll try to make the story concise because, of course, when you get on a podcast, it's always the first thing that people want to dive into. What's your backstory? And I think I've told it 100 different ways. And so I'll make it concise, but it's an important question and an important lead in. So I was raised in martial arts since the age of 4. So my background growing up was in competitive athletic sports as a basketball player, as a professional taekwondo martial artist. And I also ran a martial arts school from the age of 18 until 23. So it's a pretty deep background into athletics, sports performance, like body mastery, body mechanics, and just being a competitive athlete, both as a martial artist and as like a class or like a traditional athlete, as you might say, like as a basketball player. Then martial arts isn't necessarily a traditional sport in America, at least. It is in Asia, but not in America. So it's kind of an interesting background of being in Eastern philosophy, Eastern spirituality, Eastern mysticism, but also being really deep into Western sport. That's really the two worlds that I straddled growing up. And I won't go too deep into like that background. I want to kind of transition into like what your question, like what got me into holistic health. But I was always sports performance minded. I was always body centric. I was always psychologically centric, meaning that the connection between the mind and the body was always paramount to me. But I didn't know the connection as far as healing goes. I just knew it from like, again, like an athletic sports performance perspective. The body follows the mind over matter, training the mind to focus and visualize on the outcome that you want to get the body to perform naturally the way that you want it to. You have to train the mind and the body together, right? That's how I was raised with meditation and breath work. Before breath work was really a thing, it was just something that you do to regulate your emotional response, to regulate your stress response when you have the butterflies going into a competition and things of that nature. So I was doing all that growing up. And the reason I got into holistic health and healing was because I had 2 knee injuries as an athlete. So when I was 18, I had my first knee injury which was my MCL on my right knee. And that was from Taekwondo. I ended up getting a surgery and then having to go through a 1.5 years of rehabilitation, which completely sidelined me from my physical pursuits. And I had to train my mind and go deeper into my inner world and go deeper into my issues, if you will. We like to say that your issues are in your tissues, and maybe that's a little bit of a different part in the story. But I had to really deal with my interpersonal issues because I couldn't use my athletic endeavors and I couldn't use working out as a way to exercise, my anger and my stress and the different things that I had going on as a boy who didn't have a father and had to figure out a lot of things on my own, quite honestly, and how to become a man essentially in this world. I had to figure that out largely on my own until I had martial arts and I had mentors in my later teen years. And that's also part of my story and part of my work, kind of moving into men's development work and integrating personal development, spiritual development, and holistic health, and integrating those things as one central theme instead of them being compartmentalized and separate, because I don't think they're separate. I think they're actually the same thing. I think holistic health is the most effective and the most practical and the most real form of personal development. I think personal development without a focus on health is it's not the whole picture. I think it's missing a massive element of um, of what actually helps you develop as a man or as a woman. You have to, your health is your wealth, and that's
Mhm.
essentially what I learned when I was 18. Now that I couldn't run around and I couldn't train, and I had to really work through this injury for about a year and a half. I got that lesson in a really big way. And so that started to lead me to studying more natural remedies and alternatives, and becoming interested in health. Because when you don't have your health and you're used to having health, and now the thing that you took for granted, you no longer have, or at least you don't have the way that you did, then all of a sudden you start trying to figure out any way possible to get it back.
Mhm.
That's usually how these things work, right?
Yeah.
And so that became part of my story. Long story short, I did end up getting my health back, and I started getting into natural nutrition, not just as a way to enhance my performance, but as a way to heal my knees. And I ended up stumbling upon YouTube University. I stumbled upon people like a Paul Chek, who people like Sean Croxton back in the day, David Wolf, who became one of my first mentors in nutrition and health. I started stumbling on these guys on YouTube, and then immediately something clicked, and I was like, oh wow, there's a whole like sub world of like holistic health people and orators and speakers and authors that I had no idea these people existed. I didn't know that this subculture actually existed until I got onto YouTube in like 2008. And then I became obsessed, and I
Mhm.
started listening to all these guys. And eventually I got turned on to the raw food diet, which is a raw vegan diet. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, seaweeds, superfoods, herbs, spring water, getting connected to nature, sun gazing, getting grounded barefoot on the ground, finding myself like in nature more than not, like really gravitating towards this naturalistic whole food, at the time raw food, or we would call it sun food, food that literally contains biophotons concentrated from the sun. Like that idea just made sense to me. I was like, of
Mhm.
course, that is the missing link, of course. And I just decided to run an experiment. I said, what would happen if I adopted this lifestyle for 30 days? Because I heard about people having miraculous healing, like incurable diseases, quote unquote, incurable maladies being reversed on a raw food diet and doing holistic health therapy and different modalities to heal themselves. And so I thought, okay, well, let's run an experiment. Let's see what happens. I've been doing the other thing this whole time, and I'd love to know, can I heal my knees if I run this experiment? Long story short, I did run the experiment, and I did heal my knees in less than 30 days, so much so that I actually came to a place where I forgot that I was in pain. Because when I had my knee injuries, I had to ice my knees every single day, sometimes twice a day when I'm training. And they were about 80% back into recovery. But I figured I would just keep doing this, that this was something I was going to have to keep on doing. And then one day I no longer had to ice my knees. It was like I actually forgot about it. I forgot that I had been doing this whole time. It was like I had a total like identity shift or something. And I found myself running 5 miles in the hills, which I couldn't do for years because of my injury. And then I like woke up out of it like after I ran, and I was like, what just happened? And no inflammation, no pain, nothing. And that's when I realized, like, okay, this is interesting. Not only did I forget I was in pain, I forgot that I was ever in pain to begin with.
Yeah.
And so I acted as if that was never even an issue for me. Does it make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So that
sorry, go ahead, go
that
ahead.
I'll just kind of tie a bow on that story to say, like, what ended up happening is I realized that most people they're struggling with some sort of pain, psychological, emotional, physical, spiritual, maybe all of the above, and they're so normalized to it, they're so used to it that they've just adjusted to being in pain. They don't know what it's like to not be in pain. They don't know what it's like to be vitally healthy or happy or harmonious within themselves, in their own life, in their own body. So people have developed maladaptive coping strategies in order to numb, sedate, tranquilize, or medicate the pain that they feel inside themselves. Or maybe they don't even feel it anymore. They're so numbed out, they can't even feel it, but they're so used to that they don't even have a reference for what feeling good or what feeling great feels like. And that really clicked for me. I really realized the plight that has befallen us in terms of our health. And that inspired me to make the transition from my athletic career into becoming a nutritionist and an herbalist and a holistic health practitioner and being a renegade, like, health fanatic. And that was about, like 13 years ago. It's been a long journey, but that's kind of how I got into the door of it.
Yeah. So a couple of things that I really love that you shared is, number one, that your journey is really just an authentic embodiment and comes through practical experience. It's not something that you read in a textbook somewhere, took in a course somewhere. Like, your life experience was the classroom, was the curriculum.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
absolutely.
one thing I would love your insight on is, when it comes to people's relationship with pain, of course, there's the numbing out, the medicating, but also, how much do you come across there being some sort of secondary gain
Mm,
in
mm,
having pain, where
mhm.
there's a part of them that's actually getting their needs met? It's not that they're just numb to it, but they're actually benefiting from it in some
Yep.
way. I would love for you to speak towards that.
That's a very astute question. That's an astute observation within your question. I don't think anyone's asked me that, but I have talked about that phenomenon.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So let me think about how to start that. There's a few pieces. So when we're dealing with addiction, like, i.e., painkillers of all kinds, right? Anything can be used as a painkiller, as a sedative. Anything can be a poison or a panacea. It just depends on usage and intention of, or I should say, dosage and intention of usage, the reason you're using it, and then the amount you're using and the frequency you're using it. And we can get deeper into that kind of thing later. So if any of us are doing something repeatedly, we're getting some sort of value out of it, right? There's a certain value that we're getting out of something, even if objectively it we know that this is detrimental to us, it's not serving us, it's not healthy. People can see that this is a detrimental repetitive pattern or cycle in our life, and it's simply not good for us, it's not serving us. But there is some sort of value that we are getting out of it, whether whether it's real or not. We feel like we're getting something out of it. And that's an identity thing, right? That's an identification, an ego identification thing, meaning who I identify myself as, who I believe myself as, what I believe I'm worth, what I believe I'm capable of, what I believe my life is worth. All these things come into question. They have to be investigated in order to really suss out, why do I keep doing A, B, or C? Why do I keep reaching out for the substance, the person, the place, the thing, the app on my phone, the the browser website on my computer? Why do I keep doing things repeatedly over and over? If I'm doing it, I must be getting something out of it. I must be serving some sort of need or desire or want within me. And that's what we just have to look at, and it's really that simple. We could probably go a lot deeper into it, but I think it's important just to recognize, so we can take the shame and the guilt out of the
Yeah.
equation. And I think that's actually the biggest challenge, is the self-persecution and the self-judgment that comes, especially when you are kind of personal development minded and you believe yourself to be a good person. I'm sure you are, not you, but you, whoever's listening. If you're listening to material like this and you're trying to grow, then I'm sure you know that you're a good person. That's not the issue. But a lot of times we feel like we're not being a good person because we don't feel like we're living up to the standards that we know is more suitable to our potential. It's more in alignment with what we're capable of, but for some reason we keep living below that standard. And that's something that we need to unpack, but I think it's important to release the shame and the guilt, because that is the emotional sticky glue that holds us to these patterns, these compulsive, repetitive,
Yeah.
codependently pair bond patterns, if you will, these things that we have a codependent relationship to. And once we can release the guilt and the shame around it, then we can come into right relationship with it and start to understand, why do I feel the need, or what is the need that I'm trying to fulfill when I'm reaching out for A, B, and C?
So, what you're saying, which I think is so important, is when someone's struggling with an addiction and they're wanting to embark on the healing process of that addiction, most of
Mm-hmm.
the time people look at all the drawbacks to the addiction,
Right.
all the cons to the addiction, but it's almost like the best place to start is looking at the benefits or the
Mm,
pros to it, because then you're seeing what need is actually getting met. It's that kind
sure.
of where you're going with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's an interesting perspective, right? That's a great perspective, to be able to look at, like, what is the positive, or what's the perceived positive? What is it what's the benefit that I'm getting out of this experience?
Mhm.
And that's a good way to equilibrate, meaning to balance, to create an equilibrium in my perception of reality. Because nothing is good or bad, nothing is up or down. Fundamentally, there's always a spectrum. And
Mhm.
addiction resides on a spectrum, just like most physiological conditions, like candida is a spectrum. Different infectious conditions, like infectious diseases or digestive infections or hormonal imbalances, they're on a spectrum. So you got to figure out where on the spectrum are you in order to properly address it. Are you way far to the right or to the left? Now we're in the extremes. Now we might need an extreme response in order to balance out the extreme that we're in. In this case, addiction, you can kind of guess what that might look like for you. But if it's kind of like in the in between, or just kind of sliding, then you don't need as an extreme of a response in order to bring it back into balance, to bring it back into equilibrium. So I think it's helpful to look at things through the filter, through the prism of equilibrium, right?
Yeah.
To keep a balanced perspective, because it is very easy to look at things objectively negative, like, and then that's where then we start to feel bad about ourselves. We get guilty, we get shameful. And I do want to say too, guilt and shame serve a utility. They do serve a purpose.
Mhm.
When you feel guilt manifest inside of you as a response to playing out a pattern or an indiscretion against another person or even yourself, that means that you're conscious enough to know that this is not correct,
Yeah.
right? And that's actually a sign that you have a moral compass inside of you.
Yeah.
So that's actually a good thing. If somebody doesn't feel any guilt or any sense of shame, then they might have empathy circuits in their brain that are detached or blunted, and their dopamine receptors have been so overly blunted and overstimulated that they're no longer able to feel empathy. And now we're bordering on sociopathy, right? So I just want to
Yeah.
make that point. Like, if you feel any shame or any guilt, you don't need to feel more shame or guilt for feeling shame or guilt. It actually means that you have a conscience. We
Yeah.
just want to start to equilibrate again the response of, like, oh, I feel shame. I feel some shame because I'm doing something that I know is out of alignment. I've done it 100 times.
Yeah.
So then it just becomes about choice. Okay, I should probably stop doing this. Right. Like I should probably figure out how to work my way out of this rabbit hole that I've dug out for myself. That's how you get out of the shame. You feel proud of yourself. You start to enact courage and bravery and discipline and dedication to changing the pattern so you can feel proud, like healthy pride for yourself. That's the antidote to that shame thing. So I just want to make that point. Like, yeah. Let's
Yeah,
pause
I
there.
loved, two things that I kind of got out of what you shared is number one, guilt and shame is a sign that there is the capacity for self-reflection,
Right.
which is beautiful. And then, so that's to be celebrated. And the second thing is, it almost felt like when you were talking about that equilibrium, that healing starts to happen when you see more benefits to healing than you do benefits to the addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And once you kind of tip that scale, that's when you start moving in the direction of healing. So I love that you kind of laid that out as like a spectrum and an equilibrium. One thing that I'm curious about is growing up in the field and in the world of martial arts. A lot of martial arts is discipline.
Yep.
And discipline is the ability to go through a step-by-step process with some level of delayed gratification.
Yes, exactly.
And we're living in such a dopamine driven culture, which is all rooted in instant gratification.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd
Mm-hmm.
love for you to talk about, because I know this is one of your areas of expertise and areas of work, to talk a little bit about that and how your foundation of martial arts helped you become aware of some of the challenges in our culture today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful question. I feel like martial arts, it gave me a psychological foundation as well as a physical and spiritual foundation, but it really gave me a psychological framework and foundation that is rooted in ideas or traits like discipline and devotion, dedication, work ethic, follow through, focus, like indomitable spirit, like the indomitable spirit of the human being, like to never give up, to always do your best, like keep a positive attitude, stay focused, look in front of you, tie your belt, like dot your I's, cross your T's, like all that kind of thing has been instilled in me. I'm not perfect at it by any means. I stray away from that, and I've gone to different extremes, especially in kind of my more plant medicine exploration, to find the edges of my psyche and my spirit, and like and then but always to bring it back into that integration in the middle, right? To integrate all my report of findings, so to speak, in my explorations in consciousness. But it's interesting because I feel like martial arts gave me the anchor. So no matter what I'm exploring, no matter what I'm doing in my life, I'm always anchored on the ground. My
Mm-hmm.
feet are always on the ground. And I really like the saying, head in the sky, feet on the ground. Like allow your never enslave your mind. Always allow your mind to roam free, like your imagination, your creativity to be completely free, but keep your feet solid on the ground so you don't float off into the ethers. And
Yeah.
so you can practically do your part in bridging the heavens and the earth, right? That's the whole idea behind practical spirituality, is like bringing heaven to earth. And you can't do that if your feet are on the ground. But you also can't do that if your mind is too pragmatic and it's too rigid, and you're stuck in your form. That was the whole thing with Bruce Lee, by the way, with the Jeet Kune Do idea, the way of the intercepting fist. Bruce Lee's whole thing was to break out of the rigidity of traditional forms that were not practical in a real application. The thing is, what people don't realize about Bruce Lee is he actually mastered the art of Wing Chun, which is a very classical Chinese martial art. And so he actually had a foundation. He had a solid foundation in a classical traditional art form, which gave him the insight and the expertise to know what works and what doesn't in a real street fight, for example. But he didn't completely abandon it. He just said, hey, a lot of the stuff that our culture is so steeped on and that we're so like we kind of glamorize and we exalt, a lot of it actually doesn't make sense anymore. Like a lot of it just does not work. So we need to let go of the non-essentials and free ourselves and liberate ourselves while still maintaining the essence of our culture, our indomitable spirit, right? And so I really always took on to that. That just really resonated with me. And I think that was the gift of martial arts, is that especially being like in the holistic health world, which, you know, in these days, everything personal development, holistic health, there's an interfacing with the spiritual and consciousness movement. They're all kind of like
Hmm.
interweaving together. If you haven't noticed, like it's all kind of melding together and creating a new paradigmical structure where, again, to what I said earlier, I don't think you can have legitimate personal and spiritual development without like holistic health being like at a center focus of that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's real. And so that's cool that, you know, people like you and I and many others have devoted ourselves to the health piece, because if you focus on health and you really make that your personal development practice, you know, in your discipline, like then everything else turns on. It's pretty amazing. So, and I think martial arts fits right into that. The mentality of a martial artist fits in perfectly with that of a health practitioner. Because I'll just make this note too. I think it's interesting, and probably no one else will say it. So I'll just kind of make this note too. From a martial arts background, the greatest martial artists traditionally were also the greatest healers.
Mm.
So when we look at like Chinese medicine and Taoist Chinese herbalism and things of this nature, the greatest herbalists oftentimes were also the greatest martial artists. The healers that knew the anatomical and physiological structure of the bone and the skeletal structure and the vertebrae and like how all the joints come together and how to heal somebody and do neuromuscular release therapy on somebody's body, those people also knew how to dismantle somebody's body too,
Hmm.
right? It actually goes hand in hand. And they also knew how to heal you because they also knew how to kill you. So so those two worlds, those dualities were very well integrated in that world.
I love that. And, you know, a lot of what you're talking about, you know, with the feet on the ground and the mind's kind of reaching upward, is the alignment of the mind and the body,
Mm.
is making sure those two are always aligned. And from my experience, when it comes to addiction specifically, it feels as though a lot of addiction, the door is open for addiction when the mind and the body become out of alignment. Like there's an
Bingo.
incongruence there, whether it's
Mm.
the head saying one thing and the heart saying another thing, and your ability to make a conscious choice is very much disrupted. So
Bingo.
I'd love for you to kind of maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, again, another very astute observation and a perfect like segue into a very important conversation. You're 100% right. Like that is the perfect explanation, actually. When the mind and the body have drifted away from their alignment point, that's when there's the gray area, right? And you know, it's like that's a very interesting thing too, because every spiritual tradition has always talked about this idea of the way.
Mhm.
Like there's a way. It's not my way or my truth. Like that's a big thing that, you know, some people will like to talk about, like, oh, it's just my truth, it's my perspective, it's my way. Sure, everybody has a way, everybody has their own preference and perspective, but is my way the way? Because there's actually a way that's been laid out and templated for all of us in this realm, if you will. And every spiritual tradition, or most of them, I would say, have some sort of angle on this. Like
Mhm.
Jesus talked about the straight and narrow path, right? There's a straight and narrow path that you walk through. And the Tao is the way, right? Like, and the Buddha talked about the middle path, right? Not the
Mhm.
extremes, not the far left or the far right, but the integrated middle way. And even Bruce Lee's philosophy, I could extrapolate and say that Bruce Lee's philosophy was also based on like a Buddhist principle, like the middle way. And he was also deep into Taoism, and J. Krishnamurti, who was one of his spiritual mentors or teachers, who talked a lot about this too. So anyways, I just think that's a really interesting point, because when we get into extremes, now we're leaning into the addiction territory.
Mm-hmm.
That's where addiction lives, and that's where we become very susceptible, is where we get out of our center of gravity, and we start being pulled too far to the right, too far to the left. Either way, it's an extreme. And so part of the addiction recovery riddle, if you will, is that we have to come back to center at all times. And what does that really look like practically? Well, that looks like emotional mastery, emotional intelligence. That looks like nervous system and autonomic nervous system regulation. How do you stay in your center of gravity? It's very hard if you're sympathetically overloaded. You're constantly aroused, whether it's through pleasure and lust or it's through stress and anger. These are all sympathetic arousal states that are eliciting a stress response. And as we talked about in the beginning of this podcast, most people in the world have become hyper normalized and maladapted to being in a constant sympathetic stress response more than not.
Yeah.
So if that's your predominant reference point for what reality feels like, what it feels like to be in your body, then it's going to be very hard to change those reference points, those data files in the CPU processor of your brain, in the interface or the mainframe, which is your nervous system. Your neuromuscular system is the literal mainframe of this entire CPU processor. So that would stand to reason. If we want to change the programming, we have to get into the mainframe. How do you get into the mainframe? Well, one of the ways is through breath work. That's one of the ways that you take control of the automatic and involuntary functions of the body, and you get into that stress response system, and you start training yourself through your own action, your own volition, your own intent. You start retraining the dial on that radio station, and that starts to open up the gateway. Now that's just the starting point, like it goes deeper into different forms of structural integration work. Like I'm trained in a form of body work, if you will, called neuromuscular release therapy, where we start to get into the channeling of kinetic energy, which through the nerve junctions in the musculature, and we start actually moving the muscle so we can tap into the interface of the nervous system and start moving and resetting the mainframe, essentially, which is a pretty cool thing. I'd love to probably talk about that more as that work develops. Yeah. But you also do that through, let's say, alkalizing the body, because most people are acidic. One of the reasons, so what ends up happening, this is a really interesting point about health and biochemistry, is that your thoughts can be acidic. Your emotions can be acidic. To hold stored trauma is an acidification of your internal world, if you will. And that affects your biochemistry, right? So when you're predominantly acidic, you tend to gravitate towards more acid producing activities or foods or substances. This is a big thing with addiction, because most addictions, they're not alkalizing in nature, right? Like a green vegetable juice. It's hard to get like negatively addicted to like cucumber juice. You might get obsessed, you might get enthusiastic about it, you might even do a little more than you need to, but it's a little different than chain smoking. Mm-hmm. Right? So they're a little bit different energies, right? And they have a different response in the body. One is alkalizing, one's acidic. Positivity and optimism and happy vibes tends to be related towards alkalinity. Negativity, pessimism, and nihilism is related towards acidity. So that's an interesting thing. The more acidic you are, the more acid producing activities you tend to gravitate towards. The more alkaline you are, the more alkalinity you tend to gravitate towards.
Could you also, what would the profile look like for someone that might be rare but goes to the other extreme? Because obviously we talked about balancing a spectrum. So if you're too alkaline, could there be a lack
Mm-hmm.
of structure, a lack of discipline? What might that look like?
That's again a really good observation, because that is essentially what ends up happening when you become too alkaline. And there's a term for it called alkalosis. So
Mm-hmm.
this happens when people drink too much alkaline water, and their pH, meaning potential hydrogen balance, becomes way too alkaline. Your pH is supposed to be about 7.34 in your blood chemistry as a normal pH range. Now, most people are way too acidic again. Your stomach acid needs to be like 2.0 acidity in order to be like an inferno, to be like a furnace, to properly digest all your food, particularly the proteins and fats. Otherwise, you can start to develop like a candida type
Mm-hmm.
of fermentation issue if you're too alkaline, because parasites and other organisms can get through, because your stomach acid is not there as a firewall. So hydrochloric acid is actually the firewall between parasites and the rest of your body systemically. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? So
Yeah.
when people have like candida or they have a parasite infection, a lot of times a good HCl supplement can start to rework that and start to, balance that out. That's a little side for anyone that needs to hear that. But it's such an interesting thing when you really start to like break this stuff down and see the connections here. Because again, like, because most people are too acidic, we tend to say, okay, we need to be really, really alkaline for a time. We need to get balance. So you might need to do an extreme thing temporarily to get back into balance. But then we need to get like, once we get that range and balance, then we need a balance of both. Probably 80% alkalinity to 20% acidity is the proper balance. That's what a battery is. A battery is 80% alkaline, 20% acid. And your body is like a battery. It's like a battery pack.
Yeah.
Your adrenals and your kidneys are like a battery pack. So if you kind of strike that balance, then you'll be in that Goldilocks position.
Yeah. One thing I'd love to come back to is the autonomic nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
how when that system's stuck in that sympathetic state, the ability for people to make a different choice, the ability for people to make change, for the ability to heal, it's completely shut down until
Mm-hmm.
that nervous system rebalances. And
Yeah.
obviously there's, trauma that impacts the autonomic nervous system and a lot of variables, but it seems as though we're living in a culture that's stuck in a fight or flight state.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to kind of expand upon why the autonomic nervous system is really the prerequisite to
Mm.
any sort of healing process, whether it's addiction, digestive issues, it doesn't really matter what it is. That's
Yeah.
always where we need to start.
Yeah. And you're right. It is where you need to start, because again, it's the mainframe of your entire biotechnology. Like, I look at this body as a biological technology, like an
Mm-hmm.
avatar that's more technologically advanced and complex than any other man-made technology in this universe. Like, it's not even comparable when you really go deep into the intricacies of our physiology and our anatomy, and the skeletal structure and the fascia and the nerve endings, and just how perfectly organized this whole thing is. Like, it's pretty astonishing.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we're all still walking and talking and we're alive based on what we were raised with and what we've put into our bodies, and the unbelievable amount of identified and unidentified chemicals and pollution that is coming into us, that we're breathing in and we have no idea, in Wi-Fi fields and dissonant frequencies, and entities of all kinds and whatever else may be going on in this cosmos that we're being influenced by. It's astonishing that you and I are having this conversation right now. So I make that point to say, whatever's running this vehicle is something beyond our comprehension. But what we do know is that we have figured some things out about the physical body. And what we figured out is the nervous system is the governor of every other function and process that's going on in your body. So you can be adapting to eating the best diet ever, the best living foods, or paleo or carnivore, or whatever is really what is most adaptive for you at that point in time. And it's going to be different for everyone, by the way. And that's a whole podcast in of itself. But I just want to make that point. There is no nutrition or food practice that's going to be identical to any two people. Like, that's a really important thing that I have figured out over my years of being a professional nutritionist and looking at all the different, nutrition philosophies and protocols. Everything is seasonal, everything is cyclical, and nobody's going to have the same exact food practice or supplement routine. There's always going to be some sort of variation or unique difference or distinction. So it's a choose your own adventure story. It's something it's a riddle you have to unpack for yourself. But I'll tell you, it becomes a lot easier when you do learn to regulate your nervous system, because now the food that you take into your body is actually able to be digested and assimilated in a parasympathetic state of receivership, right? There's a lot of talk about receiving, like in the entrepreneur spiritual community, again, whatever you call these communities. There's a lot of talk around receiving. Are you able to receive abundance? Are you able to receive a love? Well, how about this? Are you able to receive the food that you're eating every single day? Are the microbes in your inner rainforest, your microbiome, are they able to fully take in and receive the micro and macronutrients of all this food that you're putting into your mouth? Are you able to receive that? Let's start with that. And that is a big function of regulating your nervous system. Yeah.
One thing that I'm curious about, I'd love your perspective on is, you do a lot of work around the dopamine reset. Right. So there's so many things that we have in our environment at any given moment that we can get that dopamine hit from, whether it's our cell phone, some food in the cabinet, whatever it is. There's so many lures that are kind of like there to kind of get us or catch us at any given moment. And it almost feels as though current day, our consciousness is actually wanting to evolve faster because of all of the things that we have to be in relationship with now versus, say, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, where we didn't have technology to deal with. We didn't have fast food, highly palliative foods to deal with. So it's almost like our ability to become self-aware, self-regulate, and grow more conscious, it's like the stakes are higher now. So I wonder if that's actually for a purpose, for our own spiritual developments. I'd love your thoughts on that.
That's a really great angle on it. And I've said for years, I've kind of said the other side of that has been that because of the advent of technology and the acceleration of technology, and especially how it's affecting our brainwave states, our neurodevelopment, like our cognitive development, meaning like because of neuroplasticity, our brain is reshaping and reforming and resynapting itself to all the inputs constantly. This is happening at such a fast pace that our brains we've never had the capacity, nor have we had the input that we have now from so many different angles, especially with social media, especially with, again, like the advent of technology on our phones, and just all the information, all the opinions, all the perspectives that we're getting and that are going into our subconscious mind that we don't even notice and our brain is reforming and adjusting to all of this. And we don't have a complete accurate read or metric on what that's doing to us. However, I will say that there is something called screen induced anxiety. We know the more screen time somebody is on, the less focused they are, the more fragmented their attention span is. We like to call it ADD or ADHD, attention dialed to a higher dimension, or attention deficit hyperactive disorder, whichever perspective you take, right? And by the way, the meaning that you give to something does influence like how it plays out in your life. So I think that's important to note. But this is very concerning, and this is why I started leading dopamine reset programs and talking more about addiction, and wrote the book on addiction. I'm working on a book called The Dopamine Solution right now, and it's an entire book just on dopamine. And because of how our dopamine systems have been trained to seek out immediate gratification instead of delayed gratification, our brain is like hardwired and entrained to get temporary pleasure in order to avoid pain and discomfort. And we know if we avoid discomfort, we avoid pain, and we chase pleasure, then we're going to create a very hard life for ourselves. We're going to create very hard circumstances for our families, our communities, and for the world at large, because we haven't grown up out of our adolescence. We haven't become adults. And there's a lot of people in the spiritual world in particular that are in adult bodies, but they're very adolescent in their emotional and psychological kind of development, if you will. They're still in fantastical worlds. They're playing in fantasy world. Their feet are not fully on the ground. Their minds are open, and that's beautiful. There is a childlike inner child wonder, and I think it's important that we all get to explore that. But we need to keep our feet on the ground, because we have real responsibilities and real duty and real dharma in this world, because the world is moving so fast, and it needs people that are integrated, embodied, and grounded, and have a clear assessment of what's going on around them. But their hearts are open, they're empathetic, but they're here and they're with it, and they're willing to do the work. And that's and again, it comes down to discipline and devotion. Do you have the discipline to put your phone down? I mean, that unfortunately, that is where we have to start right now. You know, it used to be like in the food world, it was like, do you have the discipline to put down the cookie, or to put down the I don't know, the hamburger, the milkshake, or whatever? Do you have the discipline to not do the thing that you're so compulsively pleasure seeking to do, because it's a sedative? Again, like let's actually go back to what's the value that people are seeking from all this. It's not the thing, it's the effect that it gives them. It's the sedative effect, right? So then we have to exercise discipline to put down the sedative and to feel our feelings, to regulate our nervous system, to start adopting healthy and productive habits that invoke a sense of self-love. Because I think that's where this all comes down to, if you really go deep into it. People have trouble loving themselves because they've never been taught how to. They've never really seen what that looks like. And that's what people are yearning for, right? But self-love also, in my mind, doesn't mean going off on some fantasy or some trip. It means actually getting really embodied and anchored in this present moment, and making a plan for my life, and taking the responsibility piece by piece, as I'm capable of, for what I want to create in my life. And in order to do that, I have to look at what I have created in my life and take responsibility for that. And I think you can do that as a balance. I think you can do that in a really healthy way, where it becomes fun. Like doing a cleanse or a detox can be fun. It can be exciting. You can heal yourself and have the best time ever at the same time. I think that's where we need to go into, instead of it being this like arduous, traumatic drudgery where I'm like, oh, I'm healing myself. I'm doing another ayahuasca ceremony. I'm doing another arduous cleanse in order to heal myself. I think you can have the best time ever and heal yourself at the same time. And I think that is the antidote to all addiction. You'll pop out of that addiction frequency when you let go of that density or that gravity that is associated with healing, and you allow the inner child to come out, but you also learn how to parent your own inner child. I think that's ultimately what I'm trying to get at, is like feet on the ground, head in the heavens. You let the inner child out, but you keep the feet on the ground, because that's what a proper parent does.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's my riff on that.
I love this. And, you know, I remember hearing once by one of my favorite teachers, Matt Kahn, he said, there's a difference between loving yourself and working on yourself. And a lot of people, especially in like the self-help spirituality community, they haven't yet differentiated the two. They're really good at working on themselves, but that doesn't mean they're loving them. Working on yourself can actually come from a place of self-rejection.
A lot of I know that, yeah.
And
Totally.
a lot of times it does. I would love for you to expand upon this connection between inner parenting and addiction. Because one thing I've found, not just in my own life, clients that I work with that struggle with addiction, is a lot of times the addiction is actually a replacement for a safe container that we never had as a child. So we were a child, we were going through something challenging. We needed mom or dad to be a safe container for our process. Maybe that wasn't there. It wasn't modeled to us. So now, as we're going through a challenging process as an adult, we don't know how to create a safe container for ourselves. So we might look for something else to do it for us. You know, a bottle could actually be literally the container. So I'd love for you to...
probably seen those memes, those like alcoholic memes, where somebody, there's like this homeless guy laying in the street, and he's like half passed out, and he's holding a bottle, and in the bottle is like his inner child.
Yeah.
That's really deep. Yeah.
So with that, what's the starting point? How does someone, if they're listening to this, they're struggling with some sort of addiction, some sort of maybe dependency on dopamine? I know you have your program, which we can get into. What's the starting point for people that are ready to embark on this journey?
I'm trying to think of it from like the starting point of the practical, actionable things, the mindset. But if somebody's ready, okay, yeah, I think the straight and narrow starting point is actually to go into a dopamine reset. Like that is actually the starting point. If you're like, okay, I'm ready to change. And by the way, it doesn't matter what change is or what it is that I'm looking to change. If I'm looking to change anything in the world that we live in today, it is doing a dopamine reset.
Yeah.
Because a dopamine reset is essentially a cleanse and detox for your neurochemistry, for your nervous system, and also your subconscious and prefrontal conscious mind, if you will. That essentially the dopamine reset resets the CPU processor. In doing that, it'll also reset a lot of other things. It can help reset your endocrine system, your hormonal system. It can reset a lot of other systemic functions of your body just as a direct result. And also going through my personal dopamine reset, the one that I create and craft for my clients, or I have an online program, the Dopamine Solution. I also lead group programs, 6-week dopamine reset programs. I have one coming up in like a month and a half or so. We can talk about that later. But the whole idea is that it's a holistic and integrative approach to doing a dopamine reset. And most dopamine resets are essentially just an abstinence program. You're just abstaining from the external dopamine inputs, so your brain can start to produce its own dopamine naturally. And that's great. That's an important process, an important phase. However, that is very challenging, and only a select handful of people are going to really go through that in a proper way. See, my approach to it is holistic. It's also incorporating the nutrition, There are certain supplements and certain foods and macronutrients and a way of organizing your food practices that are going to help balance out your neurochemistry, your endocrine system, your digestive system. 95% of the serotonin in your brain is produced from your gut, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of your immune system is functioning as a byproduct of your microbiome terrain, as the terrain theory of health. So you have to factor that in, and almost nobody does,
Yeah.
especially in the addiction recovery world. Almost nobody has any idea of what I'm talking about,
Yeah.
or they don't have a expertise in it, because that's just not, they haven't integrated it. They haven't been a nutritionist for 10 years, or I don't know. It's not, they're more interested in just talking about addiction as it's classically talked about. And yeah, it's like, yeah, dopamine, we know about dopamine, but not a lot of people are talking about how to fully reset and repair and reboot the dopaminergic system, which is the precursor for your testosterone system, by the way. As a man, for human growth hormone and testosterone, dopamine is a huge precursor for that entire system.
Mm-hmm.
So it affects more things in the human body than people realize. And in order to go through that proper reset effectively, easily, is I want to make this as easy as possible while maintaining the purity of it without watering it down. I want to make it easy for people. The reason why people go through intense withdrawal processes is because their dopamine baseline tanks out. So the external things, the drugs, the food, the stimulants, the medications, the pornography, all of it, whatever it is, all of that from the brain's perspective are chemical impulses that are keeping their dopamine baseline in balance. So the puffing of the cigarette, right? It gives them enough dopamine to stay in balance. Otherwise, if they don't have it, their mental cognition drops down, their energy drops because they don't have the dopamine baseline going. The brain has derived an association to an external mechanism. That's how I keep my dopamine at baseline. That's how I stay motivated. That's how I stay focused. That's how I stay energized. That's how I stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
From the brain's chemical perspective, because the brain has become addicted, not the person or your identity, which is just it's just a program, really. It's the brain chemically is like, oh, that's actually how I stay alive. It's a survival mechanism from the limbic system. And that's why we get emotionally tied to these things, because the limbic system is where all of our emotions are stored.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So by actually going through the dopamine reset, you start to go through an identity reinvention, an identity reset from somebody who's codependent on external mechanisms to stay balanced and stay alive, to somebody who can actually self-source their own vitality and their own energy, and the indomitable spirit of their own humanity is self-sourced, instead of it being resourced in minute little amounts from some external substance or person, place, or thing.
Have we always been dopamine driven, or is this a new phenomenon and it's just different because now we don't have to do something challenging or go through a process to arrive at that neurochemical state?
Right. Well, from a neurological perspective, yes, because dopamine is responsible for the motivational neural networks of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that the brain derives motivation, very similar to pleasure and reward. So I want to make this point. Dopamine doesn't actually create pleasure in the brain. It tripwires the pleasure and reward triggers, if you will, in the brain. And that's
Right.
based on motivation. So from a motivational standpoint, yes, dopamine has been the driving molecule. And to your point, because of the last 100 years, or certainly our generation and, our kind of circumference of generations in this modern world, the last 20 to 30 years, especially the last 5 to 10 years, especially in the millennial generation, the middleman of effort and discipline and work in order to achieve that dopaminergic pleasure reward response has been removed.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the big thing with pornography, by the way. One of the reasons, aside from the objectification of women and just like all the deleterious effects it has on your psyche and your subconscious and your spiritual temperament and your character, your quality of character and all that. Aside from that, one of the really problematic effects of pornography is that it removes the actual effort and energy it takes for a man to I don't know, use the word achieve a sexual engagement with a woman. There's probably a better word, but let's go with that.
Yeah.
There's a whole process, right? Of like a man actually has to have courage to get up and talk to a woman. And like, there's a whole process that goes into it, right?
Yeah.
When pornography, there is no process. There's no courage. You just push a button and you get this whole like hyper normal dump of dopaminergic stimulation. Your pleasure and reward system is being hyper stimulated. You're being flooded with more dopamine in the brain than any real life situation. And it creates a distortion, kind of like a drug. Like one of the things with drugs is that it pumps dopamine into the brain in hyper elevated amounts, and it distorts reality. And then what ends up happening is when a man engages with it, he climaxes, all that dopamine baseline dumps right away. And then the shame, the guilt, the negativity, the pessimism, the depression, if it's prolonged, especially if he's doing it to escape a deeper like nihilism or a deeper hopelessness or a deeper pathology within himself that he's not taking the healing steps to correct and heal. And this is more common than not. And the more you do that, it's going to exaggerate that negative downstream effect. So I just want to make that point. Like pornography is a prime example of so many of these things that we have shortchanged the circuits of pleasure and reward, which is supposed to be a neurological milestone of achievement. Dopamine is meant to be a reward for a job well done.
Yeah.
Like when you the limbic friction that you feel, the resistance that you feel when you're engaging with something that's difficult, the dopamine that you get as a milestone of like, hey, good job. That pleasure that you feel, that reward that you feel because you've actually done something that was difficult, something you didn't want to do, something your ego didn't want to do, but you knew was the right thing to do. And by the way, talking about reparenting, what would a parent do for a child? Just acquiesce? Oh, you want a cookie? Well, no problem. Here's another cookie. No, you can't have a cookie. And no, we're not friends, by the way. I'm your parent, you're the child, and there's going to be times you don't like me, and that's okay, right? There's a developmental relationship there. And sometimes we have to do that for ourselves if we're reparenting, right? If we have a certain relationship with ourselves where we've given ourselves too much leeway, where we haven't been disciplined enough, we have to retrain ourselves until we can come back into correct balance and correct relationship with ourselves. So, that there's a lot of things I said in there. I'm sure I don't even remember half of it, but that's a lot of what comes up for me when I think about the effects that dopamine has on us and what the detriment of removing the middleman, removing the work ethic. Once we start building that back in, the dopaminergic system starts to readapt itself in the way that it was designed to evolutionarily.
So when you're doing the dopamine reset, obviously you're removing the things that offer that instant gratification. is it
Yes.
also important to add in things that take you through a longer process, like a hard workout?
Yeah.
Or I thought of like doing a challenging puzzle that like you finish
Hmm.
the puzzle and you see like the completed piece like all together. So is it important just as much as you're removing those instant gratification sources to also add in challenging processes that allow you to arrive at the same place?
Bingo, exactly. And that's exactly what I coach people to do. And because essentially you need to create a new templated blueprint for the life that you're creating for yourself. You can't have a vacuum. You can't just stop doing something and not do something else. You learn this in nutrition, I didn't say school, but nutrition education when you work with people. There's something called compliance. And so you have to get people to comply with what you're trying to get them to do. And if you're only trying to get people to stop doing things, then you create a vacuum and a void space, and it's going to get filled up with something. This is why it's important to stay busy, not busy for the sake of being busy. However, one of the antidotes to addiction is actually being busy doing things that are productive and useful, because a lot of times addiction is a space filler for boredom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing. We're so bored. Like, it used to be impossible to be bored. Or if you were bored, you were just bored and you found things to do because you didn't have an iPhone. You didn't have
Yeah.
something you could just plug in and entertain yourself with mindless nonsense. Like, you would end up having, you go into nature, you read a book, or you write a book, or you do a sport or something. You find ways to entertain yourself and learn a skill. A lot of that has been lost upon us. So a lot of people that struggle with addiction are actually highly energetic people that are mismanaging and misdirecting their energy because they don't know how to be with themselves, or they're doing things that are actually boring to them. And what they need to do is redirect their energy into something that would be challenging but also interesting and fulfilling. And you could see the bad habits start to fall off the more
Yeah.
someone becomes positively obsessed with something that's actually useful and produces results and probably makes money, like a business, for example. Some of the best entrepreneurs used to be addicts of one form or another. Um, so that's a key insight that I want to share.
Yeah, I love that. And I found in my own life and my coaching that one of the secondary gains in addiction is it's a place that we can dump our energy into, because there's
Yeah.
a part of us that says, if I don't know how I want to use my energy, there's a part of me that would rather not have it. Because
Mm.
having a lot of life force and not knowing how to utilize it, it's kind of like being a Ferrari stuck in traffic,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly.
or drinking 6 cups of coffee and just having to sit on the couch all day. Like, you'd
Yeah.
actually rather not have the life force energy.
100%.
So, I love that. So if people are ready to take that next step and they want to dive into the dopamine reset program or learn more about your coaching and program offerings, where would you like to direct them?
Yeah, so for the dopamine reset program, they can go to hhphealth.com/dopamine. That's also my website, hhphealth.com/dopamine, for the dopamine program. And then people can find me on Instagram or Facebook. Those are my social media channels. If they want to reach out to me or send me a message, feel free. I'm very responsive. I see all my messages. I get to them as soon as I can. I also have a podcast called Holistic Life Mastery, which we need to get you on as well. And that's, we have an episode that comes out week or 2 episodes a week, depending on the volume. And I've had that podcast since 2015. I've done, like 250 interviews with every kind of topic in person in various forms of holistic health, personal development, spirituality, entrepreneurship, you name it, we've done a topic on it. And I do a lot of solo episodes and education as well. So that's a great place if people want to listen to more content or get to know my content a little bit more. You can go to Holistic Life Mastery on iTunes, and and just reach out to me directly if any of this sparked a curiosity for you. You want to know more, connect with me, Instagram or Facebook, and again, my website is hhphealth.com.
Beautiful. Ronnie, thanks again so much, man, for coming on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. Amazing questions. Great conversation. Really appreciate it.